Welcome, everybody. Welcome to another podcast supporters evening, and welcome to those of you who are watching this down the line and can't join us tonight. What we're going to do is look at some images connected to a battlefield recce that I was on last week, which was that was on the battlefields of 1914, of which more in a moment. And I've got a few illustrations to kind of talk you through that. And then we're going to look at a few contemporary images, and then we'll kind of have questions and kind of book stuff at the end as well. So last week I was on a battlefield recce. This is one of the things that I do as part of my work as a battlefield guide and product manager, I think is my official title of Ledger Battlefields, where we develop new tours, and we then, when the tour's sold and is going to run that year, we go out and we recce the ground and we kind of build that tour to what we want it to be. And the recce's are kind of less about the history, although obviously we dip into that quite a lot, and more about the kind of practicalities of where we're going to get to and how we're going to get to these places and what we're going to say, maybe in terms of themes when we're there, and where we're going to stand and where the group is going to stand and things like that. And the point of it is we kind of write up these tours, and then we go and look at a load of sites connected with what the kind of themes are, and then we cherry pick the best ones, because you can't unfortunately do everything. Although us being great enthusiasts probably would be out from dawn till dusk looking at dozens of sites in a day, a group of people on a coach tour kind of do occasionally want to go to the toilet and have some lunch and get home to the hotel for some dinner as well. So you have to kind of bear all those things in mind. And the theme of this tour, it's a tour that I was originally going to run 10 years ago for the beginning of the First World War centenary. But that year we were particularly busy on First World War tours, because it was the year that the public, probably out of all of those years of the centenary, engaged with the First World War in a massive way. And we had a staggeringly record number of people travel with us on our existing First World War tours. So I kind of canned it. Was going to bring it back at the end of the centenary. It didn't happen. And so 10 years later, I finally pulled this one out of the archives and we've gone off to do it. The theme of the tour is looking at Belgium in 1914, because I've started with this, and this is a classic image. It's in the collection of the National Army Museum in London. It shows a group of men of the British Expeditionary Force in a kind of typical summer of 1914 battlefield, fighting the kind of war that they trained for, the kind of war that most people had expected to go to war to fight in 1914, which was a war of maneuver in the open, with men engaging each other at relatively close range and often in big numbers over big landscapes. Now, this is a kind of a fantasized kind of depiction of what the BEF was doing, but as a British speaking, as an English speaking audience, this is the kind of image we probably think of if we think of Belgium, August 1914, and aspects of either the Battle of Mons itself or the retreat from Mons. And when you go to those battlefields today, you come across classic locations like this. This is the bridge at Nîmes. So that's over the Mons Condé Canal, and the railway bridge at Nîmes that is the railway line that comes into central Mons itself. This is on the outskirts in the village of Nîmes, and along this canal in August 1914, the 4th Battalion, the Royal Fusiliers, defended this particular point with 2 companies up, 2 companies back, their machine gun section up on the bridge, giving covering fire. British battalions had 2 machine guns, 2 Maxim guns, not Vickers guns at that time, giving fire support. The machine guns were under the command of Lieutenant Maurice Dease, and this became a classic kind of first British action of the Great War. Because although the only thing with that I would say is that what we see here is the battlefield that everyone knows now, and it is a very different battlefield to the battlefield of August 1914. For starters, it's not the original bridge. The original bridge was a stone bridge, and we've got some original kind of images of that. And the Mons Condé Canal was massively widened in the 1970s. So it's a much wider canal. And in fact, this bridge has been up and down quite a few times in its life. It was blown in 1918, so the original bridge was destroyed at the end of the First World War, rebuilt in the interwar period, blown by the Belgian army in 1940, rebuilt by the Germans, and then blown by the Germans themselves in 1944 when the Americans came into Mons in the Battle of the Mons Pocket. So I think to be a bridge builder in France and Belgium in that period of the 20th century, you'd have been a very wealthy person because so many bridges were blown up. But this is the kind of battlefield that we think of as English-speaking historians and people passionate with the First World War. We kind of think August 1914, Belgium, it's Mons, it's the BEF and everything else. But of course, the reality is something very, very different in that this was the 23rd of August, 1914, and the war had already been running for some time. And those very much at the sharp end of that war in Belgium was, of course, the Belgian army itself, but also in much greater numbers, the French army, the poilus, the bonhommes of 1914, mobilised in vast numbers with general mobilisation in France on the 1st of August 1914, which was simultaneous to the mobilisation within Germany at the same time. And of course, these men were going to fight Germany that was about to invade their country, having looked at the military situation in Europe in the years before the Great War. Everyone had some kind of plan. The French had this plan to move up to a part of north and northeastern France, hopefully with the assistance of the British army, and set up and wait for the Germans to arrive. And the Germans had their plan, the British had their plan to take an expeditionary force over, and the Germans had their plan, which of course is the famous, infamous Schlieffen plan developed by Count von Schlieffen years before the Great War, which took German troops across the border from Alsace-Lorraine into eastern France, and then through Belgium down into northern France. And that's kind of where this war in the summer of 1914 in Belgium comes into play. And in the early phase of it, the Belgian army tries to stem the tide of this advance through neutral Belgium with its fortifications and with its own army. And so I can just hear some in the background there. I'm just going to try and mute everybody. There we go. I'm just going to do that. Bear with me. Okay. And the fortifications don't work because the Germans have developed superior weapons to try and break those fortifications. A little bit more about that down the line. The Belgian army, small in number, doesn't really stand much of a chance against the Imperial German army. France crosses the border into Belgium to fight the Battle of the Frontiers, and it proves to be one of the costliest periods of the First World War from the French, where they're losing thousands of men, and on some days it's tens of thousands of men in the battles of those frontiers. So the kind of ground that I was going to look at, if we look at this map here, showing what for the French is the Battle of Charleroi, for Britain the Battle of Mons to the west, and we can see Mons to the west and where the British Expeditionary Force is, and then we've got this massive French army with multiple French army corps facing multiple German army corps and various divisions in reserve, covering a huge swathe of northeastern France and across the border into Belgium itself. And the battle that I went to look at last week was the battle south of Charleroi, when the Germans crossed the Sambre River and moved south in their big swing coming down into northern France in this prong of the Schlieffen Plan attack. And they met the French in the open fields and in the lanes and the woods in that area south of Charleroi in a massive battle, much bigger than the Battle of Mons, but a battle that proved decisive for the Germans, pushed the French back, collapsed the French line, pushing it south, meaning that the BEF, which had stood its ground around Mons, was now exposed with its flanks in the air, and that led to the beginning of what became known as the retreat, the famous retreat from Mons. Now, the BEF being proud regular soldiers who, their ancestors a century before had been fighting the French alongside the Germans. So it was a complex situation for their mentality. And there were all kinds of rumours that British soldiers asked their officers in August 1914, who is it we're going to go and fight? Or is it the French or the Germans this time? But they blamed the collapse of Mons, a battle which they thought they'd won, on the French to the east. But when you look at the size of the German army involved here, thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of men facing the French in these open fields that we're going to see a little bit of, you can understand why the French were under no circumstances were going to be able to hold this ground indefinitely. And if this size of army had come at the BEF, it would have seen the pretty much destruction of it in many, many ways. So what we did last week is you can't possibly cover the entire battlefield in one of these trips or even in one of these kind of recce's. So we went to look at a couple of key places, which I'm going to show you now. So this is south of Charleroi, at a place called Taren. And this is a cemetery, a war cemetery from the Great War. And it is essentially a German cemetery. And the kind of, if we think of Allied and German dead being buried side by side in a kind of 1914 perspective, we will think of San Symphorien at Mons, where the first and the last, in inverted commas, are buried, and British troops lie alongside Germans, buried by the Germans. And this is one of several equivalents of that in the areas where the French army were fighting. So this cemetery is a Franco-German cemetery, where the French dead of August 1914 lie alongside the German dead of August 1914, and the features of the cemetery are those that were built by the Germans. If you look at this, if you've ever seen wartime images of German cemeteries, you can see the kind of commonality really in the design and the entrance way. And it is a very Germanic looking wall and structure. It's a little memorial chapel there, and then you go in through the gate into the main cemetery itself. And when you're in there, there are a lot of French soldiers buried individually. We can see the crosses in the background there, but there are also mass graves, communal graves, Kameradengraben. So some Germans buried in Kameradengraben and quite a lot of French. In that grave alone, there's 123 French soldiers from the 22nd of August 1914. And what happened is this was a battle in which the Germans essentially overran the French positions. A lot of dead were lying on the battlefield following this action, and they were then buried by the Germans, and sometimes with the assistance of Belgian civilians who were kind of conscripted in to clear up the battlefield and bury the dead. But the Germans, in many cases, and we're going to touch on this, did carry out atrocities within Belgium against the civilian population and sometimes against combatants as well. But in actions like this, they obviously had a great deal of respect for their foe in that they created these cemeteries. They could have created separate burial grounds, but they created these collective burial grounds where they buried the dead of both sides, and they honored their enemy. The Germans honored their enemy. And I guess if it had been a French battle, who knows, they may have done the same. But of course, their kind of feelings were somewhat different in terms of what this war was all about. So it's a very interesting cemetery, this one, in that it is this kind of French, one of several examples of one of these French-German equivalents of what we would kind of see as San Symphorien. And there's some interesting characters buried in there amongst the graves. Now, this is right by the main entrance. And I knew that this was there, but I kind of wasn't entirely clear until I'd done a bit more research as to what this actually was. Now, this is the grave of His Highness Prince Friedrich von Sachsen-Meiningen, who was a general lieutenant, a general who fell for his fatherland near Taren on the 23rd of August 1914. He was a brigade commander and was killed by shell fire in those open battles. I mean, many of these senior commanders on both sides kind of were right in the thick of the fight in just the same way that Prussians were at Plantes-sur-Loire in 1815, and French soldiers and officers had been at Waterloo the same year and many other battles besides. And this now, of course, the difference between Waterloo and 1914, with quite a lot in between for the Prussians, with Austria, with Denmark and all these other nations that they fought during the kind of creation of the German state, and then of course the Franco-Prussian War, is that the whole warfare has moved on and become industrialized with weapons that are capable of killing on a massive scale. And no one is immune to this, whether you're a private or a general. And this general, this prince, His Highness, was killed in this battle, and he was once
buried here. Quite a lot of online stuff and books say that this is still his grave, but I've tracked down the fact that he is buried in his hometown in what appears to be a family grave, but this memorial was left behind because what happened during the war itself, and of course after this battle here in August 1914, this ground remained behind the German lines for the rest of the First World War, and Allied troops didn't return to this area until November of 1918. And during those 4 years of occupation, the Germans in these kinds of cemeteries generally repatriated officers above the rank of major, sometimes including majors, but certainly above the rank of major. There are very few senior German officers still buried on any First World War battlefield. There are some, but there are very few. And he is one of those that was repatriated. But he's very elegant and well-made headstone was left behind and remains there as a memorial, which kind of gives us a bit of an insight into the type of graves that the Germans placed in their own cemeteries during the war. And if you read Allied propaganda, they were melting their dead down and creating these kind of bone pits, and there were no cemeteries like this whatsoever. But the reality was the Germans were creating incredible places of memory, held and felt heroes' fields for their dead, to commemorate their fallen in exactly the same way that Britain, Belgium, France, and other nations besides would do. So it's kind of an interesting little thing to see, to kind of hark back to that and tie in. And in the background, you can see some small grey crosses, which are the standard headstones of the Germans who were buried in this cemetery, where now, it being reorganized in the 1950s by the Volksbund, the German War Graves Commission, the rest of the original grave markers were removed, and they were replaced by, in this case, in this cemetery, with grey crosses, which have multiple names on. It doesn't mean multiple men are buried in the grave. It just means that each cross commemorates a multiple number of different casualties. But it's a fascinating place, and it overlooks the fields where the battles took place around Taren in August 1914. And that's the general there, one of many postcards of him that are out there. And I think he was the first senior officer of that rank to be killed. His own son was killed just a few days later in the battles. And this is not untypical. I mean, Marshal Foch lost his son and his son-in-law on the same day during this period of the war. It was a costly period for both armies, in particular for officers who generally led from the front. You know, they weren't kind of sitting behind telling their men to go off. They wanted to be there on those fields of glory, leading their men forward, and often paid the price for that. So from Taren, we went across the battlefield over to this area, which to me, when I kind of researched this 10 years ago, this was the kind of classic open warfare of August 1914. And in the interim period, Wallonian tourist authorities, so that's the French-speaking part of Belgium, have put a huge amount of tourism, battlefield tourism infrastructure in, including kind of info panels like this. And this is on a little mound you go up to get a kind of view over the battlefield. And it relates to this officer, Cortel, who was killed here in 1914, because as you'll see in a minute, we're standing just in front of where his original field grave and a small battlefield cemetery was located. And what they've done is they've overlaid the modern landscape with the kind of positions of the German army and where they were, which is the wooded area you can see in the distance there, and then the French with their positions in the area around this farm where this memorial upon me is located. And this is the cross. There was an original cross here to him, and there were some other burials in front of this farm at the time. This is the point where the Germans pushed the French back to on the evening of the 22nd of August 1914. So this is day before the Battle of Mons, and he was buried here, and then his grave was subsequently moved. Look at that in a minute. And then this site was restored at the time of the centenary, and this memorial was put in place, and the whole site turned into a proper battlefield site with quite a lot of information besides. But the more interesting bit, I mean, you know, it's good to see these kind of things happening, but the more interesting bit is when you actually get out and then walk that ground itself. So we did a walk across these fields where huge columns of French met huge columns of Germans, where artillery came into play, the French moving forward in column,
with their officers going through, and this was August 1914. Many of these fields would have been full of crops. They were advancing through those crops towards the Germans, straight into their firepower, their field artillery, their machine guns, and the casualties, were just horrendous across open ground like this. The Germans using the edge of the woodland for cover in some places, particularly for their heavy weapons, and the French advancing across these big open fields. If you kind of want to get a sense of what those early battles on such great scale are like, this is a really classic kind of place to do it. And the woods in the background there are now the resting place of many of the men who fell here in August 1914. So just like at Taren, a cemetery was created for the dead of this period, created again by the Germans. We'll come to that in a minute. And then it also included French graves. This is the cemetery of Belmont. And a lot of then French graves and memorials were added after the war. And when you go in through the entrance, there's whole rows of graves. There's this memorial archway commemorating the dead of 1914 that would have led you down a path through this archway into the burial site of the dead from both nations, from both France and Germany. A lot of plaques subsequently added. It's, again, a very atmospheric cemetery with long rows of graves, including a lot of colonial soldiers. When I looked at the general whose headstone we saw in that site where he was originally buried, he was killed in fighting with Zouave troops, so French colonial soldiers, and a lot of colonial regiments were involved in the battles in this area. France mobilized its colonial forces very quickly, much quicker than Britain did with the Indian Army, and the Zouaves, the Senegalese, the Algerians, the Moroccans, and so many others from French colonies, particularly in Africa, were heavily involved in these battles of August 1914, and also, of course, paid the price for that. And this cemetery very much reflects that. And Georges Courtel, whose cross that was on the memorial site where the information and the kind of observation post was, his grave was moved from that site with his comrades in the 1920s to be buried here when this cemetery was made permanent and was enlarged. We don't have the same kind of burial records for the French as we do with the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, unfortunately. So it's much more difficult to kind of look at the movement of dead and where they went to, and have any sense of how many were repatriated, because that's the other thing, is when we look at cemeteries like this, many of the dead who fell here in August 1914 would have post-war been taken back to France to be buried in a national cemetery there. So there are men who were killed in this battle who are probably in Notre Dame de Lorette near Arras, or one of the other large ones just across the border in France, or could be taken back to their own local cemeteries and be buried there. What the kind of percentage was of that, I've never seen really kind of 100% accurate figures, so I can't tell you that, but it's given the number of graves I've seen in French cemeteries over the years, civil cemeteries, where there's a family grave and a son who fell at Verdun or Chemin des Dames or the Marne or whatever it is, buried in there as well. Then the repatriation of the dead was on a pretty big scale in France after the Great War. And I mentioned that it was another Franco-German cemetery, so a joint cemetery, and it was until the 1950s. So that's an original picture of what part of the German entrance to this cemetery here at Belmont looked like. And it was one of many German cemeteries that were closed. We mentioned about how the Volksbund, the German War Graves Commission, looked at the cemeteries that they had, and they put those grey crosses with multiple names on in the Taren cemetery. And here they decided to close this cemetery, the German burial side of it, completely, and move over 200 German soldiers in the 1950s to Langemark and Władysław to be placed in the Kameradengraben, the mass graves there. So they didn't all even go into the same mass grave. Some went to Władysław and some went to Langemark. And all there is of it today is one original headstone that mentions two soldiers who died there on the 22nd of August 1914, reservist Husman and musketeer Bocker from the 184 Regiment I've got me glasses on. Well, I've got my glasses on, but they're not strong enough tonight. And that wooded area at the back there, which is now all overgrown, that's where the German cemetery was located. So this is one of many of these kind of lost German cemeteries from the Great War. And it's a fascinating kind of a bit of research in its own right to track these down. I mean, there are you come across many 20s and 30s postcards of German cemeteries that no longer exist, particularly in Flanders. And you can go to many of these sites today, and you will see one or two features of that original cemetery which are still there. There's a good example of that in Polkapel near Ypres, for example. But there are many other kind of examples of it as well. They're kind of the ghost cemeteries of the old front line where the Germans were once buried and then moved sadly from individual graves into these mass commemorations at Meninwald and Vladslo and Langemark and Hoogelaarde and many other places. And there is a kind of belief I've read recently, people believe that those four cemeteries that are near to Ypres, which is Langemark, which many of you have been to, Vladslo, some of you have been to see the Kathy Kollwitz statues of the mourning parents there. Hoogelaarde is the less visited one, and Meninwald, which is actually the largest German cemetery from either World War, with 48,000 burials. That doesn't get quite as many visitors as perhaps that it should do. People believe those are the only four German cemeteries left in Belgium, but there are many more, particularly in this Battle of the Frontiers area. We've seen the one already at Taren. So there are still quite a number of German burial sites, but nothing like there was. And coming to kind of ghost cemeteries like this, it's really interesting to kind of tie all that together and think about just how many German burial sites there once was. So having looked at the kind of battlefields, we wanted to look at other aspects of this August 1914 campaign. And one of them, sadly, was the massacre of Belgian civilians, not just in isolated locations, but in quite a few different locations. We visited, I think, 4 different locations on this recce where massacres of Belgian civilians had taken place. And in many cases, they were very close to areas where similar massacres took place in the Second World War, either in 1940 or in particular in 1944 during the what we call the Battle of the Bulge, the Operation Wacht am Rhein, the offensive in the Ardennes, which is not that far away from some of these places that we were visiting on this recce. And the one that we came to see here is one of the better known ones. This is the town of Tamine, and that's the Sombre River. This is an original postcard, one of the Nels postcards. It comes from a little booklet of postcards about the memorial site. And this is the cross that was placed here. I believe the cross itself may have been built for the villagers, because obviously during the occupation, this was behind the German lines. They couldn't really memorialize this because the Germans were still looking at them. We'll come to the circumstances of it in just a minute. But I've got some, and I couldn't find it to scan, but I've got some pictures of New Zealand soldiers who ended up here in November 1918. And I think they had a hand in actually helping construct some of these memorials. But I'd have to go back into the New Zealand official histories to kind of double check that. But these memorials were placed in. What had happened on the 22nd of August 1914, the Germans advancing in this big action in what became the Battle of Charleroi, and in a number of places they entered villages where there were French troops, and the French troops fired at them. And some of these troops were territorial troops. They were kind of perhaps more scruffy looking, and perhaps looked to a casual German soldier more like civilians than soldiers. And a confusion, this is not me coming up with an excuse for it, far from it, because there is no excuse for this, but a confusion arose in some German soldiers' minds that civilians were then engaging them, and that civilians could become fair game, legitimate targets. But there was no evidence whatsoever that any civilians had been involved in any actions against the Germans, certainly in this area. And it was French soldiers engaging the Germans, and the Germans then came into the town, engaged the French. They shot some of the French soldiers who had surrendered, set fire to quite a lot of the buildings, and then rounded up a huge number of civilians of all ages into an area between one of the churches and the Sombre River close to the bridge. And they just opened fire and they shot them. And over 350
died or murdered as a consequence of this. And this is that square today. So the modern replacement of that wooden cross is behind me. And I'm looking across the square where the civilians were pushed into, near to that church. And this is where the massacre took place. And it's very much not just memorialized, but again, there's some really good information panels in 3 languages, French, German, and English, explaining the events of August 1914. And again, it's quite an atmospheric place. It's, I often say this on the podcast, where the kind of old world meets the new. And this is certainly one of those places, because that church was there in 1914. And the layout of this square, although it's got some modern buildings in it, it is not that different. But people go about their lives. And when we were there, people were going to buy their bread, and they were going for a coffee with their friends and so on. The events of 110 years ago were probably the last thing on their mind, but the old world, the events of those days are still very much there. And as you walk across to the church, or just before we get there, we've got the list of the names of the dead who died in this massacre alongside the memorial itself, with the Sombra River just behind there. And then you walk across to the church, and this is where the dead are buried. There are graves here, and there are memorials to the ones that are buried in collective graves. And families could have these plaques put up, and there's all kinds of shapes and designs, some with photographs, which we'll see in a minute, and all kinds of information on there. I've got some contemporary postcards of this just after the war. There was a lot more kind of elaborate crosses on some of the graves then, and they were replaced by more permanent memorials. And they're on this side of the church and on the other side of the church as well. And to give you a kind of a typical example of what's there, this is a memorial to Louis Vandeloise, and he was shot on the 22nd of August 1914, age 44, and there's a ceramic photograph of him in the middle. Now, I don't know if you can see it on there. I'm going to show you an example of it in a minute, but his plaque is in very good condition. And of course, the Germans occupied this for 4 years. These plaques didn't go up during the First World War. They went up after the war. And they contain a variety of language to describe this event. In this case, they've used fusilier shot on the 22nd of August 1914. In other cases, they used far more dramatic language, using phrases like murder, executed, and naming those who did it, the Germans, often referring to the Boche, and using all kinds of language to cast aspersions, valid ones, on what the Germans had done here. But a generation later, 1940, the fighting sweeps through here during the Blitzkrieg, and then there's 4 years of occupation again until the Allies liberate this area in the kind of late summer and autumn of 1944. And during those 4 years of occupation, the Germans take exception to these memorials, and they literally physically cut out all mention of their duplicity, involvement, connection to these crimes. Although it says shot by the Germans underneath, what's missing from here, I don't know. Obviously a phrase that the Germans took exception to, and they've chopped it out. Others are kind of ground out, so you can't read what was originally put on there. So we're kind of seeing another one of these places where the First World War meets the Second World War, and the kind of view of another Germany, and Nazi Germany in this case, and how they look back to the events of this kind of thing from a previous generation, then reacted to the kind of language that was used by the people who were on the receiving end of that. And I'm sure the people of Tamine must have been somewhat nervous when the Germans turned up again in 1940 and began to kind of look at what was written on these plaques. I suspect they probably feared the same kind of retribution as their ancestors had a generation before. So it's a very sobering place to visit, and this is coming around the other side of the church, where there are more graves and more plaques on the wall. And it's well kind of off the kind of tourist trail of things, but nevertheless, it's all part of that August 1914 story. So that's what we kind of did, and that's kind of a little bit of kind of a taster, really, I hope, to the kind of battlefields that there are in that area. If you go right along that frontier area from kind of Maubeuge right across to towards Luxembourg, really, So you're kind of diving across the border into Belgium, back into France, and so on. There are so many sites there, so many cemeteries, so many battlefield sites, so many memorials. It's a fascinating part of the battlefield, and certainly one that I kind of hope to be talking about on the podcast this summer as we move towards the 110th anniversary of some of those battles. Now, as part of this tour as well, we're kind of chronologically we're out of sync now, but we wanted to have a look at the Liège forts, and there were 12 forts around the city of Liège. This is a map, any kind of decent quality map that I could find without scanning something today, which I didn't have time to do. And the blue ones are, this is from Wikipedia, the blue ones are the First World War forts, the red ones are the ones from the next generation, because they added to the fortifications around Liège in the lead up to the Second World War, the famous fort of Eben-Emael to the north there, for example, where the gliders, the Fallschirmjäger gliders, landed on the roof of it in 1940. And Albin-Neufchâteau is another fort we visit on one of our Maginot Line tours, which is an excellent example of the later type of fortifications that were built by the Belgian army. But going back to the years before the Great War, Liège was fortified with 12 forts, varying sizes, in a kind of ring of steel and concrete around the city to protect it, and all part of this redoubt policy and tactic that the Belgians developed. They knew that their own standing army would never be big enough to kind of beat an enemy, which was most likely to be German, particularly after the Franco-Prussian War, and that the construction of redoubts around key cities in Belgium using these fortifications would be possibly the way to stop an invader from getting through. So Liège, being the easternmost city, was ringed by these forts, but you had similar forts at Namur and Dinant and Huy, and right over to the west, Antwerp as well is often referred to as the National Redoubt. If all these fall, Belgium can pull back into Antwerp and beat an invader back, hopefully from there. Now, these forts were built in the 1880s, and a lot happened between the 1880s and the outbreak of the First World War. And that brings me on to one of the forts that we visited last week, which was Fort de Loncin. And this is the central part of Fort de Loncin. And I'm going to be very naughty now because I'm waving a tempting little story in front of you, and I'm not going to tell you it because this is the subject of the next podcast that will be out on Saturday. So Saturday's podcast, you've heard it here first, will be about what happened here, and will be about what you see in this photograph and what happened to this fort. A terrible, terrible story of heroism on one scale and total destruction on the other scale in August of 1914. A fascinating place, one of the best Great War sites that I've been to in a very, very long time. So that's a kind of little bit of temptation for Saturday. So that's kind of part one. We've had a look at some of the August 1914 battlefields. And like I say, this summer, with the 110th anniversary of the battles of 1914, I hope to kind of dip in and out of that subject matter and follow it through. You know, we'll have some stuff in August about the August battles. We'll discuss, you know, a bit on the Aisne and so on in September, and then Flanders and so on in October, and you know, carry on through. That's the kind of plan, really. So that's the kind of first bit. The next bit are these original photographs that I wanted to show you, that I picked up a while ago, and I've only just got round to digitizing. Now, as some of you know, it's staggeringly 12 years ago now that I met Simon Verdigem for the first time. He's a Belgian archaeologist. He just finished his training. He'd done quite a lot of archaeological work on medieval sites and other locations, but his real love, his real passion, his real interest was conflict archaeology, battlefield archaeology. And he'd got to work for a company that was based up in Antwerp, who had been given the contract to do the archaeology for a project at the town of Messines in Belgium, south of Ypres, where they were going to put in a kind of ring main, water main, all the way in a circle around the village, around the town. It's the smallest town in Belgium. And they were going to do the archaeology following the route of these pipes. And we heard about this, myself and my friend John,
And we went to meet Simon and his colleagues to kind of see if there was any possibility that we could possibly film them. And we ended up spending a fair chunk of that year, 2012, following Simon and his archaeologists at that site at Messines, doing their archaeological work. And it was one of the most fascinating periods of my life, where we would go over once or twice a week and see what they got up to. And every week they'd found something new, and every week they'd exposed material. And we had some incredible experiences kind of chronicling what they were doing. We turned up once, and Simon had just found the boots of a casualty where it was clear there was the legs just above it. And we had to go off to go and meet somebody that we wanted to interview for the program. And when we came back, he'd unearthed the entire body, and it was an unknown New Zealand soldier who'd fallen there in the Battle of Messines in June 1917, and he was subsequently buried in Messines Ridge British Cemetery. But the kind of biggest thing, really, and there was a lot of criticism about battlefield archaeology. You know, we've got all the manuals, we've got all the war diaries, we've got all the first-hand accounts. What can archaeology really tell us about the First World War that we don't already know? And I think Simon's dig in particular, certainly for me, and I would hope that a lot of others besides, really demonstrated this, because it showed us really the development of trench warfare as made by the men themselves, because what he unearthed with his archaeology was their handiwork. And it might have said, and anyone that's been in the military will kind of be aware of this, and if you studied the military, you'll be aware of it too. Soldiers get a manual, they read a manual, they get taught a manual, they get taught a process, and when they're in the field, they adapt it based on the circumstances that they have. And it's those circumstances and those adaptations that Simon and his team unearthed. And while we were working on this in 2012, we did actually find one or two photographs of the Germans in those trenches. And then randomly, many years later, in fact, a couple of years ago, a whole collection of them turned up on eBay, taken by a Bavarian soldier in the trenches at Messines, showing forward positions right across that bit of Messines where Simon had done and his team had done their work. And this is a photograph taken in a kind of bay of a trench, a typical kind of stunted pollardy kind of tree there in the background, somewhere on the edge of Messines itself. All these are captioned, they're all Messines, and they are all, I think, from about 1916, if I remember correctly. And they show Bavarian troops, because this was part of a Bavarian army corps that held this part of the line in 1916-17, in fact, before that as well. But the interesting ones for me were these, because this showed the trench design that the Germans had built in their communication trenches and their support and reserve trenches. And this is exactly what Simon found. So when I look at this, I can picture trenches that he excavated in 2012 that look pretty much identical to this, if not absolutely identical, particularly that style of duckboarding on the floor and the trench revetment, and the whole design of it. And it's absolutely fascinating to see the actual trenches at the time and then kind of imagine what it was like. And here we see a very early trench. Those are the houses and Messines in the background, right? So it's right on the edge of the village. And we're seeing on the left, I mean, these are postage stamp kind of photographs that I've scanned and cleaned and blown up a bit. But if you look to the left of the trench, you can see this kind of wattle and daub type revetment holding up the side of the trench. And Simon found tons and tons of that in the sides of these trenches when he excavated them. They had the wood analysed to look at its origin, to find out where it come from. And pretty much all of the timber used in the construction of these trenches came from the Belgian Ardennes. So the Germans weren't shipping in their own timber because they needed that at home. They looted a country that they'd overrun. So going back to what we were looking at with the battles in 1914, the success of the German army in overrunning that whole swathe of Belgium from the border and the Ardennes right across Belgium gave them the opportunity to loot that country, whether it was timber from the Ardennes forest or coal from the coal fields of Namur and Mons and other places besides. And that kind of very primitive fire step, which is on the right hand side, where they've built kind of trestle basically for the men to get up onto to be able to fire over the trench, is very early war.
from the excavations that we saw, possibly an adaptation that they made themselves on the ground, and something that Simon did find some evidence of. But of course, later on, these trenches were expanded upon and worked upon, and in some cases were abandoned because they were not sited that very well, and this kind of thing would disappear or just fall into disrepair. So it kind of shows the evolution of this kind of style of trench work when we look at photographs like this and compare it to the archaeology. And this is for me, this is a fascinating picture because one week we went over to see Simon. He'd excavated, I don't know, 8-10 foot section of trench, and this is exact. This could be a picture taken by us going there with these flat boards that were the duct boards in the base of the trench with the side supports to keep the sides of the trench back, create a very basic fire step on one side. But beneath those flat boards was a very complex drainage system to allow the Germans to drain away the water that they had problems with. Although they were up high, some of you may remember the discussions I had with Professor Peter Doyle about the geology of Flanders in the First World War. They had the same problems with the water coming up into their trenches and the men down in the kind of low ground. In fact, in some respects on the high ground, it was worse than the low ground itself. And in the background there, you can see the trench revetments, the trench supports holding the trench, stopping the sides of the trench coming down. Again, planked, supported by bits of timber. And again, Simon's dig unearthed that in 2012 as well. So I think that's the, oh no, there's one more to come. If I can just get it to, well, I thought there was one more to come. Oh no, that looks like the last one. Bear with me. Yep, that's the last one. So I hope that's been of interest. That's our kind of little chat and some photographs to kind of whet your appetite tonight. I'm going to stop sharing that now.